Well, hello again, everyone. I'm Bill Wagner, and welcome to today's .NET Managed Languages and Runtime Community Stand-Up. So we have a host of guests here. I'm going to start with Chet Husk, who is going to be working often backstage because with the number of people we have. And Chet is responsible for for the .NET CLI. And as he points out today, he's the chat guy. So let's introduce yourself, Chet.
Yeah, you covered it. I'm a user of System.CommandLine through the .NET CLI, just like how many of you are. So I'm here as part of today's discussion to sort of serve as a representative for .NET and the CLI.
And then we have Kathleen Dollard.
Hi, how you doing today? I've been one of the people who's been involved in System.CommandLine for a very long time. And right now I'm leading the work that we're doing to reorganize it. And we'll be talking about that today. So I'll have more to share with you later, about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and various other details about it. So, yeah.
And then we have Kevin Bost.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Microsoft MVP, longtime contributor to the System.CommandLine project. Happy to be here.
And finally, Mikayla Hutchinson.
Hello.
Okay, so System.CommandLine, right? With our team, I often write command line apps as well, and I'll admit it, I don't like parsing the args myself. So what does System.CommandLine do for me?
So let me just give kind of a big picture, because not everybody listening today is going to have ever heard of System.CommandLine and know what it is. So when we were creating .NET Tools, I realized, oh my gosh, the parsers are at that point, which was about 6 years ago, the parsers are really not doing what I want. And so there were some parsers at the time, but I wanted a strongly typed parser that had a lot of features. And feature-rich strongly typed parser didn't exist. The things I got pointed to were very difficult to use. Or they came up short in some of my expectations. And so John Sequeira and I started working on System.CommandLine. And I say that in kind of an odd way because John did almost all of the work for System.CommandLine up until we started with the reorganization that we're doing. And so we really stand on the shoulders of giants here. So that was initially created for .NET Tools. Most of the Microsoft .NET tools and many external tools use System.CommandLine as the parser. And then we wound up adopting it in the .NET CLI. Chet could jump in here and say which version. I'm going to give a guess. It was 7. But a couple of years ago, it was probably 6 that we added that to the .NET CLI. So the .NET CLI also runs on System.CommandLine. It's used for a couple of other things inside Microsoft. It's used a lot outside Microsoft. We have pretty decent downloads. And so, yeah, that's kind of the background of it. And I guess I want to kind of give some scope there and answer any questions we have on what it is before I start talking about why we have to change it, because it's a big part of today's topic. Now, for those of you that why do we care about System.CommandLine? The short answer to that is twofold. One is that we do hope this is part of the .NET libraries, the VCL, and an upcoming version of .NET, so you'll have full access to it. And the second reason is that it's a story. I mean, we've been through it. And so we felt like we should just be open with the open source pain we've had, the pain we've had on trying to restructure an app going the wrong direction.
So I want to back up just a bit. So right at the moment, it's a NuGet package, right, that I'll pull in because I'm writing some kind of a console app or something with main, and I know what I want things to be, or what I want arguments to be to my program, and now this helps me.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is a really important thing I need to say right here, which is it's in preview, and we wound up taking over the space for where there had been somebody using it that gave us the space, except that we haven't been able to do that very cleanly, and so you definitely want to get the preview version.
Okay.
And Kevin might have an opinion on which preview version, because the last year of development before we decided to restructure is a little chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, somebody starting fresh today, latest preview. There's a README out on the repository that points you on the correct steps needed. So if you were going to get going today, I would recommend looking there.
It's like I gave John all the credit. Kevin gets some credit too here. Kevin definitely has been part of the coding of this thing from the beginning, actually. So yeah.
Just about, yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Do we have any questions coming in the chat? Because I don't know whether we want to go to more about what we're trying to do.
So which
Chat's been pretty quiet today so far, so forge on
so
ahead.
which I guess I'll ask first question then. Which repository is it that has System.CommandLine in it?
The repository is called .net is the organization, and the repository is command-line-API. It is not System Command Line. It's command-line-API for reasons. It was suggested to us by people that we've been trying to work with other folks from the beginning about the scope and the location of System Command Line. It's just our first stab at it, wound up kind of missing a key factor, which is one of the things we can talk about today. You know, like we have this out there, lots of people are using it. Why don't we just slap GA on it and go? And so I think it's a really good question, and it is the core of what's happening right now with it, and the core of why we're doing this today is that we are doing a complete reorganization of it. And I think I want to let me get to the slide I want to show here. Hang on just a second. Yeah, right here. So if you want to bring up my slide, I can talk to this, probably people understand. So if you look at a parser, there's two kinds of behavior in a full-featured parser. And by full-featured parser, I mean something that knows how to handle help, get default values from a variety of places, do validation. That's the kind of things that you would expect in a full-featured parser, as opposed to a parser that just gets you results. And the problem that we ran into is that we had one project, so one package that had both of these concerns slammed together. And I would say if there was one learning from this, it's that, gosh, I wish we had done that. We couldn't see it coming. So it's not that we made mistakes. It's just that, gosh, I wish we'd known when we started everything we know now. Because the parsing is very, very stable. There's been a few bugs in that for quite a while. It's the development system command line is built on the shoulders of previous parsers inside Microsoft, inside .NET. And so this is like V5 or 6, depending on how you count it, in terms of like parser evolution. And so the POSIX parsing side of it is really stable and is consistent in what the .NET CLI does, which is, in some cases, you can argue POSIX details, but at the end of the day, at some point, you have to say, this is the rules we're going to work with. And so we feel pretty solid about that part. And we also don't expect it to ever change. Because if you think about a CLI and you think about how you use it, one of the places you use it is script, which means if we start changing rules, we could break somebody's scripts. And that would be very unfortunate. Mm-hmm. So it's very stable. And when we release it, it'll be even more stable. That's what belongs in the BCL. The BCL is a place for very, very stable things, or the .NET libraries. BCL is no longer the official name, but it's the one I thought people would know that would fit on the slide. And then there's other areas that we really want to embrace community contributions. We really want to embrace evolution. We really want the world to be prettier tomorrow than it is today. There's dreams I've had about CLIs that have been thwarted in the past. And so I'm working very hard for this to be something that my dreams no longer need to be thwarted, and that many people in the community will be able to do some of my dreams for me. I'm happy to share and be able to have some really beautiful, really functional CLIs that do prompting and UX and that kind of thing. So yeah. And we didn't really introduce Mikayla very well. So I do want to go into Mikayla's role. So Mikayla is an architect in .NET, and she came on to be our architectural partner, and it's been a huge, huge impact on us just being able to figure out what it means to implement this slide. Because that's one thing I would say is that it's really easy to draw this slide. It's a whole lot harder to actually figure out this piece of code goes there. And what does it mean to have the pipeline that we need to have a very flexible system on the UX side, on the full function side. Do you want to add anything to that, Mikayla?
Not at this point. Probably later on, when we get into more of the details of how we achieved the split between the parser and the pipeline, I might want to go into more depth. Okay. But yeah, that was very much the split that we did. There was the parser that lets you take a command line and break it up into, figure out what the pieces are, what the commands are, what are the options, what are their values, and so on, and just give you a structured output. What was on my command line, interpret this into some structured form, versus the pipeline. What do I do with this? How do I interpret it? How do I dispatch, validate, and so on?
And also, how do we leave the door open for a different help system, more validation rules, and more sources for default values? So those are the kinds of things that we want to make sure the door is open for in the future.
So this may be a good time to maybe back up. I am noticing, as we said, chat's a little quiet. So I'm going to start with just some basic questions that sometimes I even have, right? So you mentioned this, you know, positive parsing, right? Now, if I think of all the programs I've used over all these years, you know, some of them, you know, on Windows would use slash and a single letter, or maybe 2 or 3 letter combos. And now I've got this dash and maybe double dash and a whole word. And sometimes, like if I think of, you know, the .NET program, you know, the .NET CLI, I do something like .NET new console minus no update check, or minus, you know, use main program. You know, I never use that one, but you know, some people like it. And, you know, so I've got these things that are sometimes just words, right? And sometimes they have to be there. Sometimes they're optional. And then I've got single dash letters and double dash words and stuff after it that sometimes. So what is this POSIX parsing? What structure, like if I'm trying to build a tool, what should I be thinking of for those terms?
It's a really good question. I'm going to hand it to Kevin, but first I'm going to say that we're not locked into POSIX, and the slide makes it look that way. You can also do Windows. One of the things that one of our goals is to be available if the MS build wants to use this, and MS build has some very weird parsing. So parsing rules were not going to be very flexible, but the actual syntax has more flexibility. Kevin, do you want to take a question on what POSIX is and why it matters?
Yeah, so POSIX is an open standard. It covers a lot more than just command line parsing, but that, at least in terms of this project, is what we've focused in on. There's a bit that Kathleen will mention coming up later about there's a couple of conflicting desires of end users versus the CLI author, and who kind of gets to define whether you're using that / the double hyphen, that kind of thing. So as much as possible, we want to try to make these tools that are built with this very nice for the end user consuming that tool. Like you were saying, Bill, when you open up a new command line tool, you want it to work in a consistent manner. You want it to be easy for you to find your way through of, hey, what are the options and arguments that I can pass to this CLI app? So giving that flexibility, but then also allowing the command line author to define effectively their grammar. What are those options? Ideally, we kind of favor going with a little more of the Unix style rather than that / which is I equate to more legacy Windows type applications, where most people are more familiar with the Unix based style for being able to specify those.
And that's really true, even if they work on Windows and they've never worked on a Linux platform at all. They're still used to this because this is the way Git works. This is the way most of the CLIs that we use today work that way. And so it's a very common. This is the double dash and the dash single character. Dash multiple characters is against the rule and fingernails on a blackboard to me. So I'll just cringe if anybody does that. We actually do allow it. We felt like we had to, but please don't do it. There's something called bundling, which I'm not fond of, but it's something that's there, and you really get in the way of bundling if you start making multi-character single dash things.
Yeah.
But put this on in the CLI. We're not doing it for you. We're giving you the tools.
Yeah, one of the nice things about the POSIX standard for command line apps is that on Unix, you can kind of assume that any given CLI tool will work a certain way in terms of how it handles its arguments, because they're all kind of assumed to follow that standard. on Windows, things aren't quite so inconsistent. Aren't quite so consistent. You do have the // but there's not really much else in the way of consistent patterns across Windows CLIs, unfortunately.
So in the .NET world, and in the programming world in general, people really have fallen into the POSIX standards. Like I said, Git, Azure CLI, many CLIs are based on POSIX, even if they stretch rules a few places. So yeah. You mentioned something else, Bill, that's really super important, which is the complexity of some CLIs. And the .NET CLI is one of the more complex ones because it does have an approach of doing everything off of one entry point, .NET, and then everything's there. And that's one of the reasons I really want to see the experience get better, because I think our help could definitely be better. I mean, we could definitely, I want a future where we have groupings and we have color and we have things that guide my eye to what I actually need to have next. And you also mentioned .NET New, which I don't think we'll go into it today, but it's a fascinating story because .NET New is a real-time, more of a real-time parser, in that it creates this declaration based on what you've already typed. And most parsers don't do that, but we do that. And .NET New is also on System Command Line, but there's a little bit of a trade-off, a handoff that happens between the static. We defined it once. It's in your that the shape of what you're entering is in the .NET CLI versus .NET New, which is you gave us a template, and that template has very specific needs, and everything that happens after you give the name of your template is completely specific to that template.
Okay.
We have some other kind of complicated use cases like that, like if you typed .NET MS build, the .NET part is using System Command Line, but then it has to essentially identify where and when to hand off the rest of it to MS build, which is handling that completely separately. So although these kind of advanced cases aren't so common, they are things that we do want to support so that we can make sure that System Command Line is used widely, is able to be used widely in the .NET ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a good point that you mentioned there. Is we're not trying to necessarily limit people into what options are available. Like the POSIX standard is a good way to design and build out your CLIs, but System Command Line, even though it favors that, it doesn't prevent you from going and building a CLI similar to an old Windows 9X CLI grammar if you wanted to. You certainly could. Probably shouldn't, but you could.
So I'll drill down here with one more interesting question. So, I like the C# top level statements, right, where I just write my main program effectively in one file, and maybe I put some specific types I need in main at the bottom, maybe even as file scope types, so they aren't in the global namespace and can't go everywhere. But so I can use args, right? But one challenge I've had is like trying to use dragon fruit, which is one component of System Command Line I really like, because then I get these strongly typed arguments, and maybe they're nullable arguments if it's an option, and so on. Is there any way to, with what you're doing, where that is going to get supported, so that I can have top level statements and somehow strongly typed arguments coming in on the command line?
Yes, we're doing this in a very kind of modular, structured way. So, so at the base level, we have this parser, which is hopefully going in the BCL, and I would hope that the vast majority of users would never end up using the parser's API to inspect the grammar. They would just be using it to construct the grammar. Then on top of that, we have the pipeline layer, which gives you a structure for interpreting that, for validating it, handling default values, dispatching based off of what was the last command, and so on. And we're designing that to be very extensible, so you can construct a default pipeline and get the default help and the default value subsystem and default invocation and so on. But if you want, you can write your own help subsystem that does help differently. It might format it differently or handle additional metadata on the symbols, or you might get a different help subsystem off of NuGet that someone else has written and published there. So we're going to give you default implementations of those, but we expect that people will come up with different, maybe better ways of doing things, and we don't want to limit what you can do there. Now, we don't have any examples yet, but there's definitely a possibility that you could have an even higher layer where you could have things like dragon fruit, which based off of generators and so on would, under the hood, construct a pipeline and grammar for you. And so those are kind of the three layers that we would expect to eventually have. Kind of along those lines as well, we have some ideas for different invocation subsystems, which would allow you to, say, automatically bind the arguments of invocation delegates to options based on their names and things like that.
Okay.
And I want to back up just a second and say what dragon fruit is for all the people who have no idea what we were talking about on dragon fruit. System.CommandLine has a way to generate only simple CLIs, but to generate simple CLIs from the arguments of a main method. And we absolutely expect to do that again. But we also will find a way to do that in top level statements. Chet and I spent a bit of time a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, working on that. And we're challenged finding something we were really happy with, but a lot works pretty well. And I think that at the end of the day, we're going to probably suggest people use a args type where they define their arguments, the options and arguments that they need inside of a type, just because it gives you more room to spread out and do things like enter your help text and things. And so we do expect there'll be generation involved to give you a really nice API when you're using it, so you can hardly see it. In my dream, you wouldn't ever touch a system command line type. It would all be under the hood. Will we get there in V1? No, but I think we will get there, and that is another space we can look to the community for doing better than us. I love it when the community can focus on a problem that we can't give that kind of focus to. But this is one we thought about for a long time. I think we have a lot of knowledge on some things that are likely to work, and I do think we'll get there. So it will be easy to use once we get to that point, easier than it is today.
So we started to get some good comments and questions for discussion in chat. So I'm going to start with this earlier one from Alex, where he was saying, it really bothers me that NuGet is not POSIX. And I'm going to rearrange this a little bit, put me at the bottom there as the host so we can see our guests when we put one of our chat things up there.
Yeah,
is this one for Chet? Do you want to pull one of us off and put Chet up? Because this is sort of it is in the .NET CLI. When you say .NET package, you're in NuGet and but Chet, do you want to comment on that one or not?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a few different forms of NuGet that we could be talking about here, right? There's the old NuGet.exe, which was shipped in .NET Framework and is still around in various distributions. But I think for modern .NET, the way most people use it is through the .NET NuGet subcommand of the .NET CLI. There's been a little bit more regularity on .NET NuGet. And part of that has come around because the .NET CLI uses System Command Line and tries to be conscious about POSIX standards for CLI arguments. And most importantly, tries to keep a consistent grammar within itself, right? Under the covers, what this is really meant for us is that the NuGet commands you use in the CLI really just rearrange the parameters of the underlying NuGet implementation, right? So we sort of act as a layer over the underlying NuGet exe. I see in the chat that there was some clarification from NuGet that we're talking about NuGet.exe. And honestly, I would not look towards really any evolution in the grammar for NuGet.exe at this point. It's not, I think, the main way that modern .NET users use NuGet. And the NuGet team overall is much more focused on making sure that the commands that they add to the .NET CLI, so everything under .NET NuGet, .NET list packages, .NET add and remove packages, all of those commands are consistent and are POSIX compliant. That's the way they're focusing on.
What I would say is that that does speak to the importance of what we're doing, in that the reason that NuGet.exe is like that is that System Command Line didn't exist at the time. There weren't really any good command line parsing libraries that I'm aware of at the time that they built NuGet.exe, because there wasn't even NuGet to get your packages from in the first place.
Yeah.
I think back in Mono, we had a few like mono.options, which I still use from time to time myself. Yeah, so that basically meant anyone who wanted to build a CLI was on their own to figure out how they wanted to handle options, which meant that things were going to be inconsistent, which meant that users of those tools could not make assumptions about those tools working like any other tools. And so POSIX is a standard for the way that, the command line part of POSIX is a standard for the way that command line tools should handle their options, but that's just part of it. Basically, the idea is that if we have a common library that most people in the .NET ecosystem use for handling their CLI input, then we get a standard behavior and a basic level of things like help and completion and so on that users can just expect a consistent baseline behavior and baseline level of functionality from all CLI tools, without every CLI author having to kind of reinvent the wheel a bit differently than all of the other people who reinvented the wheel.
And I'd like to build on that a little bit, unless somebody has something else to throw in here about our relationship with the community, because now there are some good command line tools. I mean, there's some good parsers out there, and I want to talk a little bit about that. One of which is that this is not the fun part of writing the parser. The fun part of writing the parser is maybe you're challenged by how to do basic parsing. Maybe that's interesting, but all these dumb little things about how something is going to behave, which is so often not what you expect, but when you get to the bottom of the rule, it actually does make sense. Those can be really not fun, going on forever kind of bugs. And because, they're, I believe the claim people have worked on this problem for a long time. Microsoft said over the years, over the 4 or 5 versions that there's been, thousands of those bugs have been solved. And to try to get those on your own project with your own handwritten parser, and also think about performance. That's just the grimy side of the job. We've been working with Patrick Svensson at Spectre Console for years, actually, with this design. It's taken way too long to get to this design, but that's a topic we can talk about later. And it's so the command line parser is another one that's out there. I'm less familiar with it. Kona is another one which grabs off a different problem, which is looks at hosting. So there's a lot of really interesting parsers out there now. And what we hope to do, and what we're working with Spectre to ensure that we are able to do, and we'll work with anyone else who wants to reach out and talk to us, is that we want the part that goes into the BCL, we want people who are interested in parsing and interested in that experience to be able to build on a common parser. And then they don't have to worry about any of that stuff. They just get all the behavior without having to worry about it, without having any bugs on that. And then they can work on a great API for CLI authors. My guess is that they can do better than we can. I like some things that Spectre CLI does. They can also look at better of these individual subsystems, and they can figure out what the overall experience should be, instead of getting caught up in what do you do if somebody says -x42 -x43, and that's a very it's not an easy problem. And so yeah, that's what we're trying to do here, is support that. And we are working with we're working with one CLI right now. We'll work with anyone else who would like to talk to us, because I'm super excited about some of the directions we can go on this. So
Yeah, we are well aware that we're not going to come up with the perfect solution to what the API for building a command line app should look like. There are plenty of people out there who have great ideas, and we'd love for them to build things that look completely different to our API. But we hope that by making it easy for them to reuse the parser that we've built, and also the subsystems of the pipeline, which are usable independently of the pipeline itself, that will enable people to build those without having to build everything from scratch, and also come up with different behaviors. So those people will be able to just use our command line parser and have a consistency in parsing behavior, even if they have a completely different API for actually building the app. They'll be able to use our help subsystem and not have to write a help subsystem. And by using that subsystem abstraction, it'll also mean that their command line API will allow use of any other help subsystems, that any alternative help subsystems that people have built to be able to be dropped into command line apps.
yeah.
Now that's a good segue into one of the next questions that I see. Fully starts with this. I heard some complaints that people think System.CommandLine is a bit difficult to start with. And I've come over the hurdle, so I don't really see it anymore. And then now says, I prefer writing with System.CommandLine over not using it. So that's a good thing, I suppose. And I kind of see this too sometimes. It's like when I get started on this, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, that something like, say, .NET New in our CLI is rather complicated, right? You've got a command followed by arguments that have to be there, followed by some options that are optional, and pass some of them off to a template and hand it to a different thing. Yeah. So when I first started approaching it, it's like, I've got two options for this thing, for the tool I'm building. This looks really complicated. So like, what's like a gentle beginner's guide to System.CommandLine?
Well, and then we didn't, I have so much respect for the author who did this, but we did, the help that we have was also done as though you were an expert, as though you were trying to do the hard things, and it didn't make the simple things look easy, and that doesn't help us either. So I would say that right now our API is not as good as it should be for starting out. I'm just going to say that up front. I actually believe we shouldn't have an API for that. It should all be generated, and you should just be able to say, put an attribute on a method and say, get this from the command line, get this from the args, and we'll figure it out. It's going to be a little bit more than that, but that's the kind of thinking I'd like to do with simple apps. Mikayla's like, she's wincing.
Yeah. There are some big challenges, particularly around top level statements there, because the idea of taking your main arguments as your command line options is great, but then you can't use top level statements.
Right.
So yeah, we've had a bunch of ideas and discussions around that, and I'm sure a lot of the people watching also have ideas of ways they'd like to do that, and we'd love to enable them to build those.
One other thing too.
Ultimately, I'm sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, no, one other thing, and I think this potentially adds to the confusion for people starting out, is when we first went through API review, there are docs that are actually written out on the Microsoft Docs on System.CommandLine, and there's a lot of really great information in there. The big disadvantage is one of the early changes that came out of API review was a rename of a lot of the public types. So the docs call out things like command, option, etc. But if you go and grab the latest version of the library, you're going to find that those have been renamed to CLI commands, CLI options. So for people starting out, there is a bit of a barrier in that the getting started guides have a lot of great information, and all the concepts and those things still remain consistent. But because of the kind of major renames that we started doing, not all of those APIs are named the same or quite look like the docs start. And so that's an area that we know has to get improved.
Yeah. And then if you're coming from something like Python's argparse, then the first question you have is, why do I even have to think about having so many concepts? And there are several concepts. We are trying to collapse them. We anticipate there will be less concepts for basic defining of a CLI, but only by a little bit, having to do with the way that we define the top level. But the why is there an option and argument? That we decided that the -- we would give a different type name to. It's worked fairly well for us, but argparse collapses those a little bit. So if you're coming from certain other places, you might feel like it's overly complicated, and maybe it is, but we are a full feature parser. So there's a lot of extra stuff we need you to be able to add, extra information we need in order to be able to get it right for you. So if we're going to do validation, then we need information about that validation. So that's where some of the complexity comes in, but we don't have a good way to say, you just want the simple stuff, here it is. And that's one of the things that one of our, couple of our viewers and one of our partners was very clear on. This is not you write the kind of CLI, it's not the kind of CLI I write. I write quick one-off stuff, and I don't care a lot of that. And it's harder than it needs to be for that. And I agree. I think we will make some progress in V1, but the long-term goal is that we will do generation 2, have you not have to worry about so much.
Okay. So let's see, what is another good one? This one might be a bit out of scope, but it'd probably be good to at least set what we could, if there's anything possible.
I'm just giving that one to Chet.
Yeah. So Alex, I totally agree with you. The problem, and I should say, you do actually get this today. If you install like the Linux packages that Canonical and Red Hat and whatnot put out for the .NET SDK, you get this today because those installers are able to take advantage of some conventions that exist on Linux and Mac OS platforms around how shells should look up completion scripts for tools. So when you install the .NET SDK on those platforms through what we call the source built distributions, those like Canonical and Red Hat have taken the time to package those scripts and deploy them to the correct locations. So on non-Windows platforms, there is a pathway there. There is no such equivalent on Windows. Like there is no convention-based lookup path for PowerShell to discover tab completions, right? We've had some long-running conversations with members of the PowerShell terminal team, and all up, there has to be a culture of this kind of support on the platform before we can do anything automatically when the installs happen. As like a middle ground, what I would like to get to is like you often see CLIs containing a command in them that they can use to sort of emit completion scripts. And I would like us to have that in the .NET CLI. So you could run a command, something like .NET completion script Z shell, and it would just emit the script, right? And so then we would tell users, hey, in your profile, eval this command or whatever. And you see this, I think, I saw this recently with like Cargo and Terraform. So like when you install the Rust tool chain, I believe they give you a checkbox to do this kind of thing, right? So there's a sliding scale of how we can tackle the problem. Some environments can have it done automatically today. Others will need more manual intervention, but I think we can sort of make the situation better over time.
And we are looking at some pretty big evolution in this space, because for anyone who knows System Command Line well, today it actually runs something against your application, and your application carries the code capable of creating completion information. And sometimes it's done in real time while the user's waiting, which is not a terribly good idea. So one of the things we anticipate doing is having some sort of output that could be used to build completions by a separate tool. Also could be used to build documentation, other things by a separate tool. But that is something that currently it's a feature, it's a new feature, and we're going to work to get the existing features down first. But we do anticipate that we'll have, and if anybody wants to get involved, please feel free, because we don't talk about open source right now. But that is something that if somebody comes along and says, hey, I want to do that because I really want to be able to start on this part of the problem, then we would certainly be open to that.
That to me is actually one of the features I like about Dragonfruit, is how it parses your / comments to build the help command for you when you annotate the parameters on your main method. But so moving on from that, it's an interesting idea in 3 chat questions. So any plans on adding APIs to build visual components so it's easier to provide a more interactive way? So one example, maybe as a provider, I want to show the user developer all the available options visually to choose from when executing or making use of a specific command. Just stop writing and offering the same boring tools out there and reimagining the way people interact with these. Okay, a little opinionated, but it would be cool to see something like, can I
At
get
the beginning, oh, I'm
almost
sorry.
like now that I've got Copilot installed, there's times when in my PowerShell, it'll kind of go, okay, this is like what, especially with Git commands, this is like what you've often done here, and adding things, getting that kind of an experience.
And I'm going to take that one because at the beginning I said I have dreams for the CLI, and yes, share my dreams. Absolutely. I absolutely want to see this. I absolutely want to see all sorts of stuff in this space where there is we talk about sometimes a concept, inside this group and inside certain parts of Microsoft of CLI first. So what is a CLI at core? If you strip everything away, what is it? And it's a series of commands with a series of required arguments and optional options, which gets very fuzzy, but that's okay because we don't need that to be cut and dried. But we have these things. We have a very clear definition. That is a definition of a operation. It's a definition of a set of operations, a large set of operations with subcommands. So we have this definition. We can do anything we want to with it. And we have extra information. We have descriptions already. We have an open set of data. So if you want to add long descriptions or you want to add URIs, so you want to add something else, and certainly being able to select from a set of things, and whether that is in something like using the Spectre console prompting, which is very pretty, very nice, or whether it's creating a UI and having it be a complete UX in the web or in Maui or even in WinForms. And to me, it's a very powerful future. To get there. And I was around when there was some transition in the IT space. And I just had a friend who was in that space. And one thing that was very powerful, there was some of the graphical tools would have the bottom would have a text box that would fill in what your string would be if you had typed it in, and you could copy that out and go put it in the script, or you could edit it yourself. And that kind of blur the line between a graphical user interface when I can't remember what it is. Would you help me here? And I know what it is. Let me type it. And being able to blur that line is really, really a future I want to live in.
Yeah, there are some great libraries out there like Spectre Console and Terminal.GUI that let you write GUI-like components in a terminal. We're not planning on using any of them directly in System.CommandLine at this time, but I definitely recommend them to people who want that kind of functionality. Yeah, one of the kinds of components that we would envisage people building for our subsystem pipeline would be those kinds of components. Like you could have a validation subsystem that if validation fails, pops up a terminal UI-like component that shows you what the valid options are and lets you pick one of them before you continue. Like that is the kind of thing that we would like people to build. And because that would be a subsystem that you could build, that would mean that would be something you could publish to NuGet, or you could get something from NuGet that people had built already, and you could just drop that into your System.CommandLine based app. Like we really want to enable people to build things that are reusable. Like we don't want there to be like one central place where all of your functionality for your command line apps comes from. Yeah,
and that's, I think, a key reason of why we've been doing all of this work to kind of do this reorganization of the project, is to enable exactly what Mikayla's talking about. We may not have all of the perfect systems. You're going to know what's best for your users and your application, and where it's appropriate to blur those lines, where it's appropriate to have that user interactive input versus just straight terminal options and arguments. And we want to make that available to you so that you can build that type of system out and have it ready to go.
So there's a couple of related ones while we're on this topic. Also from the same person, Manal. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. System.CommandLine enable the concept of console or terminal theming. Definition of custom themes in a console. Like, I've used I'm forgetting the name now, but there's I think it's like PoshGit or BashGit that gives you some syntax coloring and so on for my Git commands at the command line.
Well,
Yeah, it
first
doesn't
up,
necessarily.
yeah.
Go ahead, Mikayla.
Sorry, yeah. First of all, I'd say really the right way to handle this is to let the terminal itself handle the theming. Like if you use the standard ANSI colors and so on, then that enables the user to install their own theme via the terminal itself. And the new Windows terminal does support that. And so yeah, we could definitely have APIs that would make that more clear. Like currently, if you look in System console, like all the APIs talk about specific colors rather than having more kind of like semantic terms for them. So, yeah, so that's more kind of like the direction I would encourage people to go. But there's definitely things we could do to make that more intuitive.
And I do
Yeah,
have
just plus.
Oh, go ahead, Chet.
Yeah, just plus one on what Mikayla said. Typically, your app will still think in particular color names. Like if you've used the new MS Build terminal logger and your MS Build has a warning, by default, like in our code, we are saying use the ANSI code for yellow, and that this is one of the specific known color names. It's your terminal's responsibility to map that to some actual color when it's rendering the text, right? So one pro tip here, if you want to make a terminal application that is responsive to user themes, is to never hard code your own color values. That's a thing that you can do in terminals these days, but you shouldn't if you want to respect the user's choices, which means you have roughly 16 colors that you can use in your palette, and you just hope that the user makes a reasonable theme out of them.
Yeah. Oh, and there's some good reasons there. I'm somewhat red-green colorblind. Not as bad as, I shouldn't say it's bad, not as, I can distinguish some of them in the spectrum, but there are times when it's like pale blue and pale green. It's like, it's the same pale gray to me, guys. I'm sorry. And so I definitely put up themes to make it so that I can see the contrast. The used to joke is, they said our test-driven development was red-green refactor, and for me it was gray-gray refactor. So it was all fun, but it's and definitely being able to let the user accept the themes, I think, is a good way to decouple the concept of what color this is for what it means.
Yeah, like in my own apps, I like to define constants like error and warning that actually map to red and yellow, so that I'm not kind of in my mind having that idea that this thing is always going to be red or always going to be yellow, because it's not. It's going to be, it's there are common conventions for what these colors tend to mean. I'll define a set of like what I assume those conventions to be in some central place so that you can see them in one place, and I'm not kind of like scattering this all over my app.
Yeah. So I want to get back to a couple of things on System Command Line here and use this as a jumping off point. One of which is to say what is known to not going to be going forward. And that is going to be the rendering and hosting libraries. They will still be available. Everything will still be available that's available today. So if you're using System Command Line today, we're not going to break here. We're not going to break the .NET CLI. Those things will still be available. You just have to pin the preview version when we figure out how we're going to preview on top of a popular preview. We haven't got that figured out. But the rendering was an experiment and the hosting was an experiment, and neither has come to full maturity. And we think those are both very exciting spaces, but they're not ones that we're going to go that deeply into. We might have an opening for rendering. I'm very interested in some things in that space. And so our text writer, we hope to be able to replace that with a formatting text writer. And that may be that's an extensibility point I really want, because I don't want you to have to rewrite your entire subsystem and then rewrite that around having to create your own primitives. Although there's some very good libraries out there like Spectre to use. So, you don't have to actually write them yourselves. But that is kind of the direction we're going on that, is that we will have some, we may have only minimal rendering when we start. If we do go further into that, it'll be fairly high level primitives, because my dream on that is that you'll be able to, as an author, define something conceptually like a table or a section heading. And then the text writer that you pass it to knows how to format that. And the reason for that split is that I don't want to just output to the console. That is way too limiting. I want to also output to other things. I want to be able to output to Markdown or HTML. I also want to be able to output to JSON. So I want to be able to do all of that through one set of code that creates the data, creates the fact I want a table, the concept of a table, and then can output it. So we will try to have the door open for that in the future. It is certainly not a goal of V1. We are trying to keep from doing feature creep when we haven't finished yet. So yeah, that's the
Yeah, that applies to hosting as well. Like it's not something that's in our scope for the initial release of the updated version, but hosting is definitely something that we would like to get back to at some point. It's just while we're kind of like rebuilding the layers under hosting is not really the time to be rebuilding hosting.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I wonder, do we have more questions? Because I wonder if we should talk a little bit about the project and how we run the project and some things like that. Yeah.
Well, actually, I'll give you one last question. I'm not sure where this one can go. Is there a way to make dynamic language compilation easier? I don't know exactly where that could be with the CLI.
So I think the answer is probably not, unless you were really looking for somebody to parse for you. So it has been used in one other scenario for a parsing problem that was not a CLI problem. And it didn't stick in that because there were differences. It wasn't POSIX, we're POSIX. So, if you were trying to create like a REPL or something that ran commands, and this was the best syntax for you to use, but at the end of the day, it does kind of come down to syntax. And I think for dynamic language compilation, you'd probably want a way broader syntax than we have, and we can do an assignment. And so you'd have a long way to go. So I'm going to say this is probably not the right place to jump off on that question.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
So I'll throw this one up because it's a great comment, and then let you talk about how you're running this project.
Yeah. So CLI first, I love it. Thank you for saying that. I love the notion of CLI first. So first of all, we're an open source project. We have some support from Microsoft in particular. We're partnering with the BCL team and the .NET Review Board in order
You want your slides back, by the way?
I don't think so. I've decided that I don't think any of my slides, I've been looking at them. I think they're that good. So, I think it's better for us to just chat on this. But it is mostly a nights and weekends project for us. And so, we've been working on it for a long time. We'd love to have some help. So anybody who's interested in that, let us know. We're coming up very close to where we're going to have lots of pieces we can chop off and let people do little pieces. That was one of the unfortunate things about the way that the existing main is designed. Is you have to know quite a bit to really get in there and be able to understand the impact of your contributions. And we're really working to make it the opposite of that, where it's like, hey, I want to do something in help. That's empty right now. I can go work on that. And then you're working in isolation. You don't have to worry about stumping on anybody's toes and minimum merge conflicts and all of that. So that's what we're doing there. And I'm going to go to a different slide, Bill, and there's one slide I think I will show here. Because I don't think we have enough time for the topic. I am going to do something I haven't done publicly yet. Y'all are the first people to see this, okay? We haven't thrown up a timeline before, and so I'm going to throw that up because I really think it's important for people to have not have unrealistic expectations. So we will not make November. We will not be in the BCL in November. I will just tell you that the way the BCL works, they work very far ahead because everyone depends on them. So they need to be settled, solid, no changes early in the process, and we couldn't possibly make their deadlines this summer, even if they have time to review, and they probably wouldn't. I do hope that we'll be able to go into preview around that time. We do have some challenges around our preview because the extent of the use of the existing preview means that we would need a way to tell people, don't use this new one. So it's possible that we will, I don't know how we're exactly going to preview off of NuGet, but we will be working on that. And then I hope to be in the .NET 10 previews from very early. That is the goal that we have. We are only marginally on track for that right now. It's very early. We have lots of time to catch up, and also lots of time to fall behind. So we, if anybody's interested, we're Powderhouse is the branch we're on, and that's the way we identify ourselves within the System Command Line repo. So I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It is the System Command Line repo, but the name of the repo is Command Line API. So in the Command Line API, you're going to see the word Powderhouse, and that is what we call this effort. That's our code name. And the reason for that is a square in Boston. It's not because we think the house is going to blow up. It's because there's a square in Boston where two of our members happen to live near it, and we thought that was just as good a name as any. So that's where we got the name. And I take any questions on that or any thoughts, but I do want to really shout out to everything that came before this project, because we definitely are building on all of that, and we're able to look at problems like what should the pipeline look like, and how should we pass values across, and these kinds of problems we can only think about because the problems with parsing and the problems with what are the subsystems that we need, which were not obvious when this project started 6 years ago. All that has been done. We're building on that, and so we're able to look at new problems in new ways, and it's a lot of fun. But it's also that's what we're working on, and it's been a tough 2 years for us. There's been a lot of things happen. What they're out that's been both from personal on some of the people on the team and and also lots of things have happened in the last few years, and it's been very slow. I apologize to everybody who's been wondering what the heck we've been doing, but I wasn't willing to stand up and say this is what we're doing until we were already doing it, not just dreaming of the future. But babies have been born, parents have died, things have happened, lots is going on the team over the last, marriages have happened, lots has happened on the team over the last couple of years, and so it's slowed us down. You're laughing at us. I'm laughing at me, right? A lot. Life has been happening. Yes. So yeah.
We've all had these things happen. This has been good. I did have one final closing question. I'm kind of surprised nobody else answered it. So since anytime I'm writing, say .NET based console apps or a .NET tool or something, it runs on multiple platforms.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's System.CommandLine or something else, but I would love to have a consistent thing that gives me a consistent globbing experience, right? So if when I'm running on Unix, I just get all those things sent to my app because the shell globs for me. And I'm on Windows, and now I'm suddenly getting star.star as my argument. I don't want to do that work.
It's really good, Bill. I hadn't heard that one before, so that's good. I absolutely learned something there. So yeah. Oh, and one thing I didn't mention is we're also trimmable. I have to point that out because your application should be trimmable. We shouldn't stand in the way. So we are trimmable. So we will be more.
I should answer this.
Go for it.
So on a Unix system, if you type star.star as an argument to a command, the shell expands that to give you the list of all the files, and that's basically the glob pattern. And so any pattern like that, if I were to do star.md to find all my markdown files on Unix, I get an array in the arguments that is one element for each file. On Windows, I get star.star, and I have to use the file APIs myself.
Well, on PowerShell or CMD, maybe. But I personally use Bash on Windows, so I also get the expansion. Right. So
it
is shell. Yeah, it's shell dependent, not operating system dependent.
No,
I would be very, I would be very, very wary of trying to eat into the what's really the shell's territory there, but because yeah, like if there are ways to do that, it on particular shells, then the recommended way should be to do globbing however that shell does it, even if it's not the same way as other shells do it. That said, the particular example you cite might be an exception to the rule. I don't know.
If it's not doing it at all, and we know it's not doing it all, maybe we should give it a shot. I don't know. It's a really interesting question.
So I popped it in because I actually have some context here. So what Mikayla said is broadly correct, right? So Linux shells, Bash, Z, Fish in general, like they all have very sophisticated support for globbing. This will happen recursively. You can glob for a single character match or whatever you want. PowerShell on non-Windows platforms will also mimic significant chunks of this behavior. But for compatibility reasons on Windows, it doesn't. This is an ongoing conversation with the new versions of PowerShell, PowerShell Core, that you can get and run on any platform because it is a .NET Core application these days. So if this feature is important to you, Bill, or anyone listening, go to the PowerShell repo, +1 it. Over the past several releases, 7.0 through I think 7.4 is what they're on now, that team has been working really hard to bring a lot of the behaviors that are useful when doing shell scripting on other platforms into PowerShell. My personal favorite example of this, on Nix platforms, it's very common to write to standard error when you have some sort of high verbosity message or you want to do some logging notification that is not directly relevant to the output of the command the user entered. If you do this on Windows, on PowerShell versions like 7.2 and below, PowerShell will convert everything you wrote to the standard error channel to an actual error and stop processing, right? This makes it hard to write scripts or to write tools like the .NET CLI that would like to put logging on that channel. So that's changed, I think, in 7.3 going forward. Like they've got this whole new subsystem that does the right thing now. So that team is working to bridge some of the feature and functionality gaps. They just need your feedback to help them prioritize what the behaviors should be. /rant.
I'm on my way. No, that was really useful though. Thank you. So yeah, I don't really see a lot of more. Yeah, we are at time. This has been super useful. Definitely check this out and get involved. Like I say, I do know almost every .NET new command I have is a console app of some kind, so I'm definitely interested in how this keeps going. And happy to hear from all of you. And with that, thank you to Mikayla, Kathleen, Kevin, and Chet, who pops in and out as needed. And we will see you next time on the Managed Languages and Runtime stand-up.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.